Hi everyone, this is Dr. Mike, host of the free iTunes podcast, Psychiatric Secrets Revealed with Dr. Mike, but that's not why I'm here today. This is a Saving Savvy episode. Actually, it's a Photography 101 episode, and today we're going to talk about the very important concept of aperture. So what is aperture? Aperture, if you look at your camera, if you have a DSLR, you'll see that it has a little A. That's Aperture Priority mode. Here's a Sony, it has that A. Here's a Nikon camera, it has a little letter A. And in fact, if you look at some better compact cameras, they'll also let you use Aperture Priority, because it's probably the most common manual mode that professional and amateur photographers use. So what is Aperture Priority? What it means is it allows you to control the aperture of the lens of the camera. The aperture means the opening. So a large aperture is a large opening and lets in a lot of light to the sensor. A small aperture is a small opening and it lets in a lot less light. Now here's a confusing point or two. In cameras, we measure the aperture of the lens in something called an f-stop. And between each f-stop, complete f-stop, you have a doubling of light. Now, you would think that the bigger the f-stop, the bigger the aperture. But that's actually not true. It's the opposite. So a big f-stop means a little opening. A small f-stop means a large opening. So if I said I'm going to shoot with this camera at an aperture of f22, very tiny opening. If I say I'm going to shoot at an f of 2.8, very wide opening, letting in more light. Let's kind of look at f-stops in another way. So f-stops, each time you go a full stop, it's a doubling of light. So this particular camera has a nice lens on it, and through its entire zoom range, it has an f of 2.8, which is pretty bright, lets a lot of light in. This camera has a cheaper kit lens on it. It roughly has the same zoom range, but it goes from an f when it's at its widest angle of, and I don't know if I can even see this clearly, of 3.5, and then when you zoom out to telephoto, its widest aperture is 5.6. So 5.6 is a lot smaller than 2.8. Now, why does this have a constant aperture over its entire zoom range? And why does this one go from 3.5 to 5.6? It's just cheaper to make a lens that does that. And so this is a kit lens, and so they compromise a little bit, and you have that variability. Now, I can take this lens that has a constant aperture of 2.8, and if I choose to, I can make it smaller. So I can say, no, I don't want to shoot at 2.8. I want to shoot at an f of 4 or 5.6 or 16 or 22. And I can make that lens smaller if I choose to. And I'm going to give you I'm going to show you why in a minute. I can do the same thing with this lens, except it's just not as light sensitive. So, for instance, I was at one of my daughter's graduations. It was in a gym, and the gym was not very well lit. So if I wanted to really zoom out as much as I could so I could get as close to her and take that picture, having the ability to have a very fast lens with a f2.8 aperture made a lot of sense, because I was able to gather as much light as possible. If I would have used the lens on this camera, I probably could have done it, but I would have had much less light. So how much less light? When this is zoomed all the way out, it has an f of 5.6. That is 2 f-stops above 2.8. And so every time you go an f-stop, it's a doubling of light. When this lens was wide open, it was actually letting in 4 times as much light as I could with this camera. So what are the other advantages? Why wouldn't we always want to use the widest aperture possible? Well, for two reasons. Sometimes we don't really need to have all the light in. If it's a bright day, if I'm using a flash, I certainly don't need to have the brightest lens on the block, and I can get by using a much less expensive lens. The other thing that you need to know is that the wider the aperture, the shallower the depth of field. What's the depth of field, you might ask? Well, that means how much of the image is in focus. So if I am here, and if I'm focusing on something here, a narrow depth of field will just keep this object in focus and everything else will be blurry. If I have a deeper depth of field, a lot more in front and a lot more behind will be in focus. So I'm going to go to some pictures now and show you what I mean. So let me go there. Okay, so we're using our tree as a subject, and this is at an f of 2.8, and I'm roughly about 4, maybe 5 feet away from the tree. And you can see that the tree is in focus, but everything beyond the tree is out of focus. Go up one f-stop, so we're going to go from f2.8 to f4. Tree's in focus. Background is blurry, but a little less blurry. Let's go up one more s-stop. So we'll go from 4 to 5.6. Tree's in focus, background's blurry, but even less blurry. Let's go up one more. Now we're at f of 8. Tree's in focus, background's blurry, but less blurry. Here it is at 11. Things are starting to get into focus now. If we go up to f16, the background looks, well, not quite in focus, but more in focus. If we go all the way up, the tiniest pinhole that this lens will allow, f22, everything is in focus. Now let's say I step away from the tree, and I'm going to be now, I think probably about 12 or 15 feet away from the tree. That's this scene. So the first thing you'll notice, I'm at an f of 2.8. The tree's in focus, the background is blurry, but not as blurry as before. If I go to an f4, blurry, but not that blurry, the background. f5.6, starting to look like the background's starting to get in focus. If I'm at f8, looks like the background is pretty much in focus, as at f11. So the closer I am to my subject, the blurrier it's going to be, and the wider the aperture, the blurrier the background is going to be. So let me get out of the screen and I'll tell you why that's important. So the reason that's important is that sometimes I really want my background to be blurry. So if I'm taking a portrait, it's very attractive to have the person's face in good focus, but the background, like those books back there, to be blurry, because then all of the attention is focused on the face. But what happens if I wanted to take a landscape? Maybe in the distance there were some houses, and in the far distance there were some mountains. So then I'm going to want to use a high f number, in other words, a tiny aperture opening, because then all of that will be in focus, not just a narrow slice. So there are times that we want to use a wide aperture because it lets in more light, and we can shoot in darker conditions without a flash. And the other reason is we have a narrow depth of field, which means I can really localize like a face or a person while blurring out the background, or a flower, or whatever I wanted to do. There are other times that we want to use a very small aperture, and that's going to be a very high f number, like f16 or f22, those kinds of numbers, because then I'm going to have a very big depth of field. Everything's going to be in focus. Everything's going to be tack sharp. However, so in other words, the building that's maybe half a block away is going to be in focus, and the mountain that's maybe a mile away is going to be in focus. And if I have enough available light, like it's daylight, no problem with that little opening. One more funny thing to tell you about, and that is a property of lenses. Oops. So this lens, I can change the aperture from 2.8 at any setting, which is going to be wide, down to the smallest aperture that this lens will allow, which is an f of 22. The funny thing is that sometimes you need to use that f of 22, but sometimes when you get to the extreme limits of the lens, because of physical properties of light and how it kind of bounces around inside the lens, the image will appear to be less sharp. So you're always better off going an f-stop below the tiniest f-stop, or maybe even 2 below the tiniest f-stop of your lens. So if this lens has its smallest aperture opening is an f of 22, I'm going to want to go below that, like maybe an f of 16 if I can, to get the sharpest image, just because of the physics of the way light bounces around inside the lens and inside the camera. The other thing to know is that sometimes you can get lenses with very, very low f numbers, in other words, really wide lenses, but they have a tiny, tiny, tiny shallow depth of field. So even though I potentially could buy a lens that has an f of 1, if I was focusing on someone's face, I might just get their nose and part of their cheeks in focus, and the rest would be blurred out. That's how narrow that depth of field is. So when shooting, like let's say a portrait, a lot of people will shoot in the 4 or 5.6 f range because they know the whole face is going to be in focus. They might shoot a little bit lower if they want to do a more artistic look or for other reasons. If you're going to shoot, let's say, a crowd of people where there's a row and then there's a row behind me and a row behind there, I really don't want to use a very wide aperture. I don't want to use a low f number like 2.8 because the camera will focus on whatever I'm focusing on, maybe that first row or in the middle row, but then the other rows will be out of focus. So when it comes to situations like taking a shot of a large group of people, I'm going to want to use a fairly small aperture, in other words, a fairly high f, maybe f8 or f11, and in cases like that, if I'm indoors, I might have to use a flash, but then everyone's going to be nicely in focus and things will look good. So that's my talk about aperture. I hope it's helpful. Please subscribe so I do more of these videos, and if you get some time, please listen to my absolutely free podcast. It's called Psychiatric Secrets Revealed with Dr. Mike. It's on iTunes and other podcatching sites. And as always, have a great day.